My name is Daniel Botsman. I teach Japanese history at Yale University in the not-so-United States of America. And I'm truly honored to have been given this opportunity to formally welcome you all to the third Modern Japan History Association Distinguished Annual Lecture. This is the MHJA's flagship event intended to honor the achievements and contributions of a foremost scholar in the field of modern Japanese history, as nominated and voted on by the association's members. If you're not familiar with the association and its activities, or if you'd like to learn how to become a member, please be sure to visit the website mjha.org. I guess at an event like this, it's not so surprising that the speaker is someone who literally needs no introduction. But obviously, I cannot let this occasion pass without pausing to acknowledge Professor Andrew Gordon's extraordinary contributions to our field. For the past 4 decades now, Professor Gordon's scholarship has not simply shaped, but has defined the study of modern Japanese history in the Anglosphere and beyond. His pioneering research on labor relations and his landmark monograph, Labor and Imperial Democracy, remain foundational to our understanding of the history of Japan in the pre-war era. His edited volume, Post-War Japan as History, opened up or helped open up the era after 1945 to sustain scholarly inquiry by historians. And his own book on the shifting power balance between labor and management in the post-war iron and steel industries set new standards in the field. His innovative cultural history of the sewing machine has illuminated transformations in class, gender, and consumption across the modern era, and those, of course, are just a few of the highlights. In addition to his remarkable scholarly output, Professor Gordon has distinguished himself as a public intellectual and methodological innovator. He is literally famous in Japan, not least for his writings on baseball, including his book on Matsuzaka Daisuke of his beloved Red Sox, which I think it's fair to say anticipated much of the global excitement surrounding Ohtani Shohei today. He's also been a leader in the digital humanities, most notably as the driving force behind the Japan Disaster Digital Archive created at Harvard in the wake of the 3/11 triple disasters. And of course, he has stood up to help ensure that basic standards of scholarly inquiry are not simply swept aside by those driven primarily by their own political fantasies. For many of us, the personal role that Andy has played as a mentor, colleague, and academic citizen have also been profoundly important. It sounds like a cliche, I know, but it is simply true that generations of scholars and students have benefited from his extraordinary generosity, his deep insights, his integrity, and tireless advocacy for the field. And if there's any question about his dedication to our field, I'll just mention that Professor Gordon currently has COVID, and has very kindly agreed nevertheless to persevere with the presentation this evening. For those outside the circle of specialists, Professor Gordon is of course best known as the author of A Modern History of Japan, the textbook that has set the standard for teaching in our field for more than 2 decades. And it's the evolution of that text that will of course be the focus of his lecture this evening. There will be time after the presentation for questions, and I will be very happy to moderate the Q&A. But without further ado, I'm going to now hand things over to Andy for his lecture, which I know we're all very much looking forward to. Thank you so much, Andy.
Great. Well, thank you, Danny, for that super kind introduction. Before I share the screen, let me just say, yes, I tested positive for COVID a week ago, but thanks to Paxlovid, and maybe it was a mild case. Anyway, I've been feeling basically normal for about 4 days, and although I did have still a positive result this morning. I want to thank not only Danny for his introduction, but thank Nick and the Modern Japan History Association, not only for this invitation, which is a great honor, but also for founding the association in the first place. I think it's fair to say that even the founders didn't quite realize that they were meeting a need that was so widely felt in our field for a place where historians of modern Japan, both students and teachers, can come together and share ideas. And this project has succeeded marvelously over the past 3 or 4 years, and I've taken part in some events, and it's a great honor to speak to you this evening. But let me jump into my talk. Okay, one well-known axiom about the crafting of history was stated in a book that all of you in the audience of a certain age, and maybe most of you, read probably in a course on historical methods. The author of that book was E.H. Carr. The book was called What is History, published in 1962. And the key phrase, at least that I'll be using as I hope tonight, is this one, that history is an unending dialogue between the past and present. Tonight, I'll try to give specific life to this certainly well-worn phrase, but I still think important claim. I'll introduce the internal dialogue through which I have considered and reconsidered the Japanese past since the mid-1990s in the process of writing and then revising a modern history of Japan. And I'll briefly touch on the revisions going to the second, to the third, to the fourth edition, and then most of the time on a preview of what I hope to achieve in a fifth edition that will likely be the last one. So it was about a little over 30 years ago when I was on the faculty at Duke. My colleague there, Bill Chafe, a renowned historian of the United States, approached me and said, why don't I write a textbook for college use, a survey history for college use on the modern history of Japan. He had done something like that for the United States and found it valuable. He introduced me to his editor at Oxford Press. I agreed to do the book. It took longer than I expected and was more difficult than I expected. I had casually or facilely thought that I could just take the lecture notes from my staple course on Japan's modern history and write them out in full prose. Well, it wasn't that easy. I learned how sloppy the lectures were, how many things I ought to have spoken about that I didn't, and it took about 6 years. The first edition was published in 2001. One thing I had not realized at the time was how insistent the publisher would be, not only on me writing the first edition, which obviously they wanted me to do, but on publishing subsequent new editions. The publisher's goal, which I shared, was purely mercenary. Very quickly, if the book sells well, the used book market is full of copies, and those, when they're bought, bring no revenue to the publisher and no royalty to the author. But there's another valid reason to revise the book. Not only did new events or trends of historical importance continuously unfold, which need to be incorporated into a revised final chapter or final couple chapters, but as Carr said, as the present changes, a historian's view of the past, of the topics that need to be explored, of the perspectives that ought to be introduced or rethought, changes as well. You see here the 4 covers of the English editions, which came out just about every 6 years, and also to the covers of the first volume of the 2 Japanese editions. The first and the third edition were translated. That there was interest in this translation really surprised me. I did know that monographs written in English on modern Japan's history or on Japanese history in general, including those written by many of you in the audience, I'm sure, have been translated into Japanese, as was the case with a couple of my books. But I was surprised that there would be interest in a translation of a general history, a general survey. At times, I felt that Samuel Johnson's famous and famously misogynistic statement about female preachers applied to how Japanese readers might view my work, especially this general work. To paraphrase Boswell, or to do a kaiuta on Boswell quoting Johnson, a foreigner writing Japanese history is like a dog walking on 2 legs. It is not done well, but you are surprised to see it done at all. But whether it was for this reason or not. And either way, I'd be happy about it. There was interest in the translation, and it does seem to be widely read. The first edition had a general stance that I haven't rethought as I've done subsequent editions. The book's title signals the importance of two themes, as I intended anyway: modernity and connectivity. A more typical title might be Modern Japanese History. I think that's the default title of many survey courses on this topic, including at some points in time my own. Such a title suggests that the Japaneseness of the story is central. Modern Japanese history. Modern modifies the Japanese. It points readers to a peculiarly Japanese story that unfolded in an era we call modern. I tried to flip it by calling the book A Modern History of Japan to signal a different balance. I try to tell a peculiarly modern story as it unfolded in a place we call Japan. So now let me turn to the three actual revisions of Japanese history that I made with a changing present in mind. In the first revision, which came out in 2007 to 8, pointing to the second edition, it was the flame of territorial disputes reignited in the present that prompted me to revise the narrative of the past. Between the first and second editions in 2003 to 2004, tensions had arisen around sovereignty over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands between Japan and the PRC, when the Japanese government took over lease of the islands from a private owner. Chinese protesters tried and in one case succeeded in landing on the islands. This is a fanciful image of the Chinese flag asserting sovereignty that was produced by somebody in China at the time. 3 years later, 2006, also saw heightened tensions between South Korea and Japan over sovereignty over Takeshima, Dokdo, or Liancourt rocks. As I worked on revising the book, I realized I could not just insert these matters into a revised final chapter. I realized I had insufficiently, which is to say, not at all, indicated the complexity of border drawing in the 19th century. I needed to bring the long-term presence of these boundary matters into an overall narrative of the modern history of Japan, to recast these present-day island disputes as part of a long-term history of expanding and then contracting borders of Japan, starting at least with the 1860s. I didn't and still don't see my role as judging the validity of any present-day claim, but I did want to describe the process by which various historical claims to territory were made, and I came up with the formulation that you see here, that we see in the Meiji era a process by which a new Japanese state was seeking to draw borders and incorporate territories at the vaguely defined margins of new nations and old empires. And as you know, these disputes are still ongoing. The major present moment between the second and third editions, the second one published in 2008 and the third in 2013, that was top of mind in my dialogue with the past, it won't surprise you to learn, was the March 11th, 2011 Great East Japan disaster, earthquake, tsunami, and meltdown. This, of course, both demanded in-depth discussion itself in a final chapter as contemporary history, and also it required a historical framing that was not there in my prior editions. Those editions were egregiously weak in discussing Japan's vulnerability to disasters, or conversely, in discussing the accumulated experience of responding to disasters. And I think it's fair to say that I'm not the only guilty historian in this regard. More generally, I think historians have not well integrated the history of disaster into the history of Japan, or more globally, the history of disaster into the history of various places. The challenge then is how to do more than just insert a list of disasters in respective chapters, from Edo-era fires and earthquakes to the Nobi Plain earthquake in the Meiji era in 1891 to the Sanriku earthquake and tsunami in 1933 to the, well, this is out of order, the Kanto Daishinsai and post-war typhoons. So I see two ways to do more than just list the disasters. Certainly there are more as well. One that I tried to do was to make the point that disasters can shape and do shape culture and politics beyond the moment that they take place. One example of this would be the 1855 Ansei earthquake in Edo. It not only destroyed and burnt down homes and took people's lives, took their property, but it also destroyed the Tokugawa shore batteries and helped undermine confidence in the Tokugawa regime more widely. It's not to say that it brought down the Tokugawa directly, but it was part of a series of events that undermined its foundations. Conversely, the 1891 Nobi Plain earthquake, I don't have a visual here, generated pride in Japanese traditional architecture as resilient and in seismology as a field of high excellence in Japan. So on the one hand, a disaster that undermined confidence, and another, ironically, a disaster that raised it. A second way to go beyond just listing disasters is to make the point and show how they are never only or mainly natural, but always socially produced in some measure by humans. In the case of March 11th, we can, of course, point to over-reliance and overconfidence on seawalls. We can point to the myth of the nuclear safety that is in large measure responsible for the Fukushima Daiichi meltdown. We can also see disasters in the past as social in the role, for instance, that new technology in gas lines played in intensifying the devastation of the fires of the 1923 Kanto Daishinsai, or in decisions to rebuild communities in places known to carry risk, as happened after the 1933 Sanriku earthquake and tsunami, and then was pointed out again in 2011. In moving from the third to the fourth edition, which came out in 2019, my internal dialogue concerned not so much a new event as a change in the current day practice of history, in this case, the emergence of the history of the environment as a major focus of historians globally. Somewhat on the late side, or very belatedly perhaps, and not somewhat, this trend in historiography came to shift my own view of what had been significant in the past in Japan. Although it's also, I think, fair to say that there was an event or a drawn out present day event that sparked, in some degree, the rise of environmental history. And that's the fact that we are now living in an epoch with a new name, the Anthropocene. So I felt a need to integrate the environmental history of modern, including late Tokugawa Japan, into a more general history. Now, unlike the border drawing issue or disasters, I had not entirely neglected the environment in the first three editions. I had covered the major post-war pollution cases in some detail. But this discussion stood alone without much context. This endeavor, I should say, was more complicated than the prior revisions, and I needed help. And I received excellent support from two research assistants, John Hayashi and Reed Knapp. I tried, I fear, with limited success, and I'll hope to do better in the next edition, despite their terrific help, but I tried to develop several interpretive threads tying the history of the environment into the modern history of Japan. One thread, inspired by conversation over the years with my colleague Ian Miller, was the centrality of the modern history of Japan as to the world of unlocking energy from the environment, whether coal, which can be called ancient biomass, or more conventionally understood biomass, such as forests and whales. The centrality of coal to the economy of Japan from the Meiji era through the 1950s is well known. But at least in my narrative, in earlier editions, it was not nearly prominent enough. Now, the Japanese government has done a poor job in many ways in its official interpretations of history, in my opinion, including the industrial history of the Meiji era, but at least in its nomination to UNESCO for World Heritage recognition for Kyushu industrial revolution sites, it did put coal mining at the center. So it got that right. A second thread was the dynamic and complex relationship of resources and new technologies, including the unintended consequences of new policies to manage those resources. We see in the late Tokugawa era resource exhaustion, at least in relation to the technologies available at the time, especially in the cases of silver, gold, and copper. And here is a photograph of the Iwami silver mine, also a World Heritage Site. But we also see the Tokugawa era policies of reforestation as both celebrated by scholars in Japan and some Anglophone scholars, but also a practice that unintendedly tended towards a monoculture that has had negative impacts. That is, the singular cultivation of sugi, which both beginning in the Tokugawa period and then more intensively after World War II under US occupation era reforestation policies, has made Japan an allergy superpower. A third thread tying environmental history to existing core narrative of Japan's modern history, which does connect back to the first one about energy, is the importance of energy resource competition in the longue durée of US-Japan relations. From Perry there on the left, though those aren't whales that Perry sought, but it's a drawing from the 1840s, evokes the sense of that era. From Perry and competition and desire for whales and the energy that can be drawn from whales, to World War II and the desire for access to petroleum oil in Indonesia. In this map on the right, we have at two key moments in Japan's history of relations with the United States, a resource question, an environmental question at the heart. I changed other things, of course, in each new edition, but to the extent that each edition had an agenda of being informed by a changing present to rethink the past, these were the core points in each one: sovereignty issues, disasters, and the environment. For the rest of the talk tonight, I want to turn to the fourth revision, heading to a fifth edition, aiming to have it done in 2027. At least that's what I've just promised the publisher, and so I'll try to keep my promise. Here, my main goal, inspired by the present moment of the 2020 pandemic, which came just 6 months after the current edition was published, will be to position the history of public health and medicine as a key aspect of the history of modern Japan. The pandemic, like March 11, 2011, was a sudden present event that forced me, in any case, and I imagine forced others, to rethink a broader historical narrative. Like March 11th, COVID could not just be tacked on in a last chapter, or at least one could do that, but I think it would be lazy and irresponsible, a refusal to engage in a dialogue of past and present. I wrote, with hindsight, embarrassingly little on public health or medicine in the existing editions. Just a brief mention of smallpox in the Tokugawa era, a short account of tuberculosis contracted by female textile workers in the Meiji and pre-war eras, and a discussion towards the end of the 1980s tainted blood scandal that infected hemophiliacs in Japan with HIV. My core point in looking towards this revision is that disease and public health is particularly resistant to borders and particularly impossible to narrate in a bordered national frame. For that reason, it is a powerful and useful topic for reinforcing key points that I've been wanting to make all along, to tell a modern story that unfolds in Japan, a story in which global connections of many kinds rest at the core of this history. There are so many aspects to this endeavor that I will not be able to do justice to them tonight, or I imagine in the revised edition once written. Some that I am well aware of and are the focus of important recent English language works, but won't address this evening, but do hope to touch upon in the revisions that connect to this point, include the history of chronic illness and disability. And here I am inspired by Susan Burns' work in 2019 on leprosy, and the transformation of traditional practices of mental health care in modern times, as has been nicely elaborated by Yumi Kim in 2022. One topic that begs for discussion is cholera. It entered Japan from outside, first in 1822 during the first cholera pandemic, and with increasing severity in the mid to late 19th century. With permission, and I hope it's okay to use it in this talk, I would like to use a print like this one or this one to dramatically make the point that this disease was seen as among the terrors of the West and of global integration, even as modern systems to contain and treat it. And here in the middle, the jar is carbolic acid or sekitansen. were adopted in Japan. The efforts to understand and fight this disease connect directly to the development of systems of hygiene. And the history of cholera can actually be connected indirectly to the contemporaneous or more or less simultaneous emergence of modern systems to monitor the bodies and health of women sex workers, which I also will discuss in the revised book. At least one recent article on the British Navy in Japan, in Yokohama specifically in the 1870s, discusses together the efforts of Japanese and British and other foreigners to address these twin scourges in the treaty ports of cholera and venereal disease. Now, before talking about other aspects of this revision, I want to briefly give you all a break from the narrative and digress into the perils of using AI as a fact checker. As I was preparing this talk, I wondered if other survey histories of Japan dealt with cholera, in which case I was particularly guilty of failing to do so. But last week, as Danny mentioned, I was working at home because of my COVID and had no immediate access to the several hard copy survey texts in my office. So I turned to the latest version of ChatGPT in the Harvard AI Sandbox, and I asked, do English language survey histories of Japan discuss cholera? To my astonishment, I was told that, and this is a direct quote, Gordon talks about the modern cholera epidemics in the context of westernization and public health reforms of the Meiji government. He uses cholera as an example of, quote, so this is ChatGPT allegedly quoting me, the disruptions of early modern times, end quote, and the stimulus to new state interventions in hygiene and health. See early Meiji era chapters. Varies by edition, for example, second edition, page 87, and the discussion of urban life and modernization. I was floored. Wow, did I really write that? Have I forgotten? Is my memory that bad? Was I actually a little bit ahead of the curve more than I remembered? Of course not. I checked my own text, which I did have at home. I didn't mention cholera. So I got annoyed at ChatGPT, sent it a scolding note. You were wrong. Why did you make this mistake? Here is the answer I got. Accuracy is important, and you are correct. Andrew Gordon's A Modern History of Japan does not mention cholera, and this boldface was in ChatGPT's text. Directly in any edition, my earlier response mistakenly included him based on a general association with common themes, Meiji-era social issues, urban reform, and public health, that appear in survey histories, but I did not verify the specific mention of cholera in this text. Then, without further prompting, a very contrite artificial intelligence went on to explain what led to my error. And this is the quote. Survey histories often discuss modernization and westernization, in which cholera and other epidemics commonly feature as catalysts for public health reform. Therefore, I presumed it would be included. This was the kicker. This is why I'm taking you through this. It's very painful. Basically, my takeaway is not just that one cannot trust AI on such queries. It is also that in the mind of artificial intelligence, a discussion of cholera is so obviously of central importance in the history of Meiji Japan and so well known that surely any idiot, including Gordon, would have discussed it. Well, it will figure prominently in the next edition, I promise. There is more to be said about the late 19th and early 20th century Japanese engagement with East Asian and global infectious diseases and cures, medical science and treatment. Some of it I've already looked into during the pandemic and written about in some blog postings at Tokyo College of Tokyo University and in an article in the JJS that I co-wrote with Michael Reich. I'll just selectively touch on a bit of these moving on. Moving from the 19th into the 20th century, of particular interest to me has been learning of a through line from efforts to fight plague in Northeast China around the start of the 20th century to the practice of mask wearing, both in response to the Spanish flu and thereafter, the so-called Spanish flu. Mask wearing as a public health practice emerged in a far from linear fashion, with no clear national champion, and until recent decades, mainly until the COVID pandemic, there was no sharp east-west divide in mask wearing or in the perception of mask wearing around the world. This is a complex story of the global exchange of knowledge and practice in which Japan figures prominently. I've learned that the modern medical origins of masks worn for health purposes are Western. Masks called respirators were developed in the US and Europe from the 1840s to protect miners from coal dust and firemen from smoke inhalation. By the mid 1880s, advertisements for the sale of respirators began to appear in Japanese newspapers. But until the 20th century, the respirator was not seen to be useful specifically to fight contagious diseases. The consensus among experts was that poor hygiene accounted for the most dangerous vectors. In the case of the bubonic plague in Hong Kong in 1894, the villains were fleas carried by rats. The German-trained Japanese doctor Kitasato Shibasaburo did pioneering work with a German colleague to discover the rat-borne germ that caused this outbreak. Nearly 2 decades later, however, in 1910 to 1911, during and after the destructive outbreak of a pneumonic plague in Manchuria, a key moment came in debate and innovation over the use of masks to fight such diseases. The key actors were experts and officials of the Qing regime in its waning days, the Russians with their stake in the China Eastern Railway, the Japanese with their corridor along the Southern Manchuria Railway, as well as French and British figures. They engaged in intensive, mostly competitive, and mostly unsuccessful efforts to understand and control the disease. The Japanese authorities focused mainly on exterminating rats. They assumed that this new outbreak was a form of the bubonic plague. A Chinese doctor, however, Wu Liante, trained in the UK, discovered from autopsies that the plague germ was found in the lungs of diseased patients. He concluded that this plague was an airborne respiratory disease, and he promoted the wearing of masks among medical personnel and, it seems, the wider public. He has come to be celebrated in China as the heroic plague fighter of the North. But there does not, and this is a bit of a puzzle to me, there does not seem to be a direct line of transmission from his advocacy to a subsequent spread of mask use either in China or elsewhere in Asia. And this is also puzzling because another key figure and ally of Wu's in this episode was Kitasato Shibasaburo. He was at odds with other Japanese authorities. Unlike them, he concluded Wu was correct, and he vigorously supported Wu's approach to fighting the disease. In the end, they had no success in making the case for masks during or in the immediate outbreak of this plague, but they were on record as having advocated for this. The case of the plague in Manchuria shows the importance of examining global flows of knowledge and competition between nations, and especially when we think of how Kitasato was set against his colleagues in Japan, the importance of disaggregating national units and looking at fissures within a nation. Now, less than a decade later, the unfairly named Spanish flu struck the world. In Japan and its empire, about 600,000 lives were taken, 400,000 in Japan's Naichi, and about 190,000 in colonized Korea and Taiwan. This is an extraordinary number. It's far more, about maybe 5 times more, than the total number of war dead in Japan's modern wars up to this point in time. It is embarrassing to admit that, like cholera, I made zero mention of Spanish flu in a modern history of Japan. But here I can take a little consolation, and I checked this by actually consulting the relevant books previously when I had been in my office, not asking ChatGPT, and knowing that none of the several authors of survey texts that I have in my office, there might be others I haven't looked at, none of them even in 1 or 2 words, not to mention a paragraph or two, mention the flu pandemic. One part of the Spanish flu story, it's not the only important aspect for Japan, but it's one I am tempted to include in my revision, in Japan and globally, is that the use of masks came to be widely promoted, as in this poster from that era in Japan, which was recirculated widely in Japan during the COVID pandemic. What surprised me is that the route of transmission for mask wearing, as I mentioned, was not direct from nearby Manchuria, where just 8 years earlier, Wu and also a major figure, Kitasato, had promoted it. Rather, Japanese authorities followed medical practice in the US. In October 1918, municipal authorities in San Francisco mandated, quote, the wearing of gauze masks by every person as a means of preventing the spread of the influenza epidemic, end quote. So mask wearing attracted worldwide attention. The practice spread with the disease from the US to Europe and then to Japan and its colonies. It didn't stop the pandemic in its tracks, but likely it blunted its force to some extent. This traumatic episode planted seeds of health practice that would only later sprout. Japanese newspaper articles that I found in 1927 and 31 urged mask use during the cold season of those years. But as late as 1957, and this is an article from Asahi that year, in the face of a particularly virulent flu season, Tokyo authorities felt the need to argue through the press with this headline, that mask mo kokangaro, that masks are also effective. That is, in addition to other things. And that readers, it's in the text, it's all blurry, you can't see it, but readers should rethink their value, especially for wearing in crowded places such as department stores. The practice apparently had not yet been naturalized, that is, even by late 1957 in Japan, to the extent that people had to really be pushed to wear masks. To sum up, then, the story of Japan's 19th century through 1930s engagement with infectious disease can only be understood in the framework of both Japan's empire and global flows of knowledge, pathogens, and health practices. All the major diseases that were foci of early vaccination efforts in Japan circulated globally: smallpox, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, influenza. From the 19th century to this day, Japanese doctors and scientists have studied immunology at leading global research centers. Since the late 19th century, they have published their findings in leading Western language journals, which is, by the way, convenient for our students who don't read Japanese, because if we want them to do research on this topic, we can send them to British and American medical journals. Japanese medical authorities widely administered vaccines for cholera, influenza, smallpox, typhoid, and pertussis. A continuing story then can be told, and I will try to weave it into the new edition, of disease and health policy from wartime into post-war Japan under Allied occupation, centered particularly on vaccines and vaccine mandates on the one hand, and on efforts to control women's bodies on the other. One key figure in this regard I will discuss is Crawford Sams, a military doctor, and during the U.S. occupation, the chief of SCAP's Public Health and Welfare Section. He and his office is best known and celebrated for presiding over the imposition of the strictest vaccine mandates in the world at the time, and perhaps since, including quite high fines for noncompliance. The war had devastated Japan's existing public health system. In large measure to protect the occupation forces, Japan's American overlords in 1948 pressured the Japanese to pass and implement the preventive vaccine law. It required routine vaccines for smallpox, typhoid, typhus, diphtheria, pertussis, and TB, tuberculosis. It authorized vaccine mandates to be added as needed for other infectious diseases. The complex context for this law ties into both wartime and post-war Japan and the process of repatriation, including concern for the health and purity of Japanese bodies beyond these diseases. Early post-war Japan did see a surge of disease, especially cholera, typhus, and smallpox, variously said to have, one, entered Japan in wartime along with drafted or forced laborers brought from the continent, and two, to have been brought home by repatriated soldiers and civilians. And infectious diseases were in any case spreading in Japan and were spread further among these populations and by them, it appears, as people were vulnerable due to harsh working and living conditions and the devastation of the bombings of the cities. So disease was spreading widely. The occupation era concern with these diseases and this law aimed at the entire population, and the result was a universal national program of mandatory vaccination, which I do think saved many lives. But a parallel and in some ways related concern focused especially on two specific categories of women at this time, framed by decades of eugenic thinking in Japan. Kristen Roebuck, in articles and I believe in her forthcoming book, shows that eugenics in the post-war era came to focus in particular on the purity of Japanese blood. One group whose purity was enforced were women repatriates who had been raped by Soviet soldiers, or in some cases, it seems, were bartered to the soldiers by Japanese men seeking to win their own safe passage home, as work by a former student of mine, Sarah Kong, shows in work she's undertaking at present. In a horrendous episode, when these women arrived in Japan, they were given abortions, in some cases forced, and in some cases better termed infanticide, given that the women were in their 8th or 9th months, and the fetuses that were delivered were viable. The other group, besides the repatriated women, to undergo a monitoring of their sexual health were Japanese sex workers, both during the occupation and afterwards in the so-called R&R rest and recreation centers maintained by the Americans, whose bodies and sexual health was policed not mainly or only to prevent the birth of mixed race children, which was the concern of Japanese authorities, but to lessen the likelihood that Allied soldiers would contract venereal diseases. So this is a case of the United States and Japanese authorities seeking or interested in the same policies, but for different primary reasons, I think, as I put it here on the screen. The vaccine policies surely saved lives, but they were also implemented with a haste that carried forward directly to the 1970s and indirectly thereafter, connecting in an intriguing and important way to the era of environmental protests and lawsuits, and pointing to a complicated history of odd, in some ways perhaps problematic, alliances or cross fertilization of protest. The high-handed American push for the preventive vaccine law led producers in Japan to put out vaccines with excessive haste right away, and it led them and the governments of the two countries to cover up the problems that resulted. This sowed seeds of skepticism in the public toward mandatory vaccines, which would reemerge decades later. The worst case was the Kyoto Shimane diphtheria incident of November and December 1948, just about a half year after the promulgation of the preventive vaccine law. Under pressure from SCAP and the Ministry of Health and Welfare to begin mass vaccination of infants as soon as possible, the manufacture of this vaccine did not effectively detoxify many lots of the diphtheria toxoid used in the inoculations, and government health officials sloppily sampled the quality of the vaccine. Thousands of infants received toxic vaccinations. 84 died. Another 854 suffered harm, in many cases quite severe ongoing disabilities, such as paralysis of limbs. Some victims sought redress at the time. The issue was briefly raised in the Diet. The manufacturer was found guilty of negligence, but no government officials were sanctioned. And SCAP, with its control of Japanese media, together with the Ministry of Health and Welfare, mainly covered up with success the extent of this traumatic event for many years. So, despite some protest, there was no widespread immediate backlash against either this vaccine in particular or vaccines in general at the time or shortly thereafter by the survivors or their parents. Rather, indeed, in the late 1950s, far from suspicious and resistant, the Japanese public embraced modern medical science with remarkable fervor in demanding access to the polio vaccines. And this episode fascinates me. At the time, the polio vaccine was being developed mainly in the United States, but with cooperation, in the case of the Salk vaccine, with the Soviet Union in clinical trials and in the rollout. That was an unusual moment of Cold War cooperation to save lives. Polio had been present in Japan in modest numbers since the 1930s, but an uptick of infections came in 1959 to about 2,900, followed by a near doubling in 1960 to over 5,000 cases. The government at the time was promoting domestic development of its own version of the Salk vaccine to be administered by injection. But this vaccine domestically produced was not yet ready. The state faced intensified pressure. Sabin's oral vaccine was available for import. It had already come into use. In early 1961, Japan appeared on pace for an even wider outbreak than 1961. And in April, an NHK reporter took it upon himself to pressure the government to respond by broadcasting daily reports of new infections. By late June 1961, with the summer infection season just beginning, this media-induced storm of demand for action won the day. The Health and Welfare Minister announced a mass campaign to import and administer the vaccine. This was remarkably effective. I find it astonishing that in the month of July 1961 alone, just in that month, 13 million infants and school children were inoculated, and the case count plummeted. By year's end, only 24 infections had been reported for that year, under half the previous year. To me, the most notable aspect of the polio story is the strong popular and media campaign for mass inoculation with the imported vaccine. Organizations of women were among the foremost advocates. The Japan Socialist Party was significant in its support, and so was NHK, playing what, to my knowledge, is a rather unusual activist role in trying to shape policy. So, to step back from the particular, I think the 1950s to 60s were a high point of vaccine enthusiasm among the Japanese public, and this is part of a high point of a more general enthusiasm for all of modern science and technology, including, as it was emerging at the time, the production of nuclear power. But a longer legacy to the occupation era tragedy of the Kyoto Shimane incident nonetheless continued in the form of a submerged but powerfully felt anger among survivors toward vaccine mandates they believe were imposed without sufficient attention to safety, no transparency, and inadequate compensation. In the 1970s, about 25 years after the incident, survivors and their families, as well as parents who lost their children, renewed calls for redress and legal reform. They joined forces with groups seeking compensation and legal changes in response to a string of other claims of vaccine side effects. These mobilizations demanding compensation and legal changes are strikingly similar to protests mobilized beginning in these years by the victims of industrial pollution. They emerged with new force, these demands, in the late 1960s and 1970s, contemporaneous with protests over food contamination, protests over other pharmaceutical injury, and environmental pollution protests. It seems pretty clear that different constituencies learned from each other as they pursued their goals. It's from the 1970s, with limits to be sure, that we can find in Japan a new anxiety over the potential, and not just in Japan, over the potential dark side of modern medicine and science, reliance on artificial chemicals as well as modern industry. At the same time, these episodes point to an important thread of health system nationalism and protectionism across the post-war decades to the present. We see this in the polio case, where prioritizing the domestic industry delayed the import of an effective vaccine. We see it in the tainted blood scandal, which is one of the few public health issues that my text already does discuss, where the Japanese government refused to import safer, properly heated and treated blood to Japan to try to protect and nurture a domestic blood industry to horrendous effect. I think this sort of nationalism played some role in the relatively slow rollout, although eventually very wide implementation of COVID vaccines. Now, there are more threads to introduce and to research, but I want to wrap things up here by simply saying that for me, and I expect for many of you, each with your own emphases, it is indeed the unending dialogue with the present, the aha or wait a minute moments that come from thinking about the past in dialogue with the present, that are the source of the endless fascination we find in studying and writing about the past. So thank you very much.